I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference, and in particular Arish, for inviting me to talk to you on the topic, which is the myth that consumption of saturated fat from animal sources as well as tropical oils increases one's risk of developing coronary heart disease. So where does that myth? That's on the next slide, in which you see it promoted by the American Heart Association. Here at their website, supposedly on the Facts on Fat, they emphasize the great value and consumption of liquid vegetable oils such as corn oil and soybean oil, on the left where you say love it, and to the far right where they say lose it, emphasizing that consumption of tropical oils here such as coconut oil will increase your risk of heart disease, raise bad cholesterol. So they emphasize the importance of lowering cholesterol. And this is where that myth has been around now for over 60 years. So what I'm going to cover in what I consider sense and nonsense in the war on saturated fat is, first, I want to give you a bit of a historical perspective on how it's actually excess carbohydrate that actually causes obesity, which clearly is linked to heart disease and other diseases of Western society. The second is I want to explain to you how it is that dietary science went awry and why it was that saturated fat, including animal and tropical oils, has been demonized. And finally, I want to show you the actual science involving ecological studies, experimental studies that actually demonstrate the value and the health benefits of consumption of the different forms of saturated fat. So I think it helps to actually look at a bit of biochemical history. So we go back to 1862, and Claude Bernard, French scientist, made an important discovery that, in fact, one does not need to consume any sugar or carbohydrates at all, that, in fact, the liver is able to produce all the blood sugar we need from converting it from proteins. And, in fact, what we do is convert fat into a form of energy, ketones, and so we don't need to consume any carbohydrates to be able to have sufficient energy at all. There was a doctor in the audience at the time. Dr. William Harvey had come from London to listen to Claude Bernard. And both from his personal experience and what he learned from Claude Bernard is that this excess sugar that we consume, whether it's from corn or bread or potatoes, it gets converted by the liver into sugar. And if that sugar isn't used, it's converted into fat. And so that explains why cows that are fed excess grains and corn become fat. It's what you see here. And so he related that to people that he had seen that were obese. And he hypothesized then that obesity is caused by excess consumption of carbohydrates from bread, potatoes, and sugar. Upon returning to England, he had an ideal test case. That man being William Banting. Banting was overweight, over 200 pounds at about 5.5 feet tall. He had tried many different approaches to try to lose weight, all of which had failed. He was 60 years of age, clearly having impaired health, developing type 2 diabetes. And he told Banting essentially to reduce the carbohydrates in his diet, greatly reduce the potatoes and the bread. Banting lost over 50 pounds. To lead to having a very healthy level of weight. And then Banting wrote about this, essentially the first real diet book called Letter on Corpulence, which was first published in 1862 and then republished in 1863, in which Banting described exactly what he ate and how he lost weight, and how he became healthy. Banting then lived into his 80s on this kind of diet. And which was not bad for 19th century London to be able to live that long. And so we got this information going back into the 19th century, that what really seems to cause obesity, which increases risk for all Western diseases, is excess consumption of carbohydrates. In the U.S. as well, clinicians were noticing the association between excess carbohydrates and obesity. And so here you have a book written by Dr. Emmett Densmore in 1892. And here is the cover of the book, clearly stating this book is an argument against the use of bread, cereal, pulses, which are beans, potatoes, and other starch foods. And a direct quote from his book is an obese person may be given a diet of meat, exclude the bread and potatoes. That person will reduce to a normal weight. As soon as the patient returns to a diet of bread and potatoes, he begins straight away to increase in weight. I'm skipping over a good bit of research consistent with this finding in the 20th century to a summary delivered by Dr. George Thorpe to the American Medical Association, published in JAMA, 1957. Summarizing, the evidence is quite clear. A high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet is effective for a successful loss of excess weight. So you see that for about a century, clinicians had targeted excess consumption of carbohydrates, bread, potatoes, and sugar, to be able to lose weight. And in fact, carbohydrates are the source of excess weight gain. And so Robert Atkins, a cardiologist, was aware of this research and implemented it into his clinical work, in which he's helping people at high risk for heart disease. And so after about a decade of using this in his work, advising patients how to lose weight and to become healthier, he wrote this book, 1972. Now, he called it The Diet Revolution. But I have to say that when you compare his book with what Banting wrote over a century before, that they're really quite similar in what matters, which was Atkins targeted carbohydrates as the cause of obesity. And that's really what Banting wrote about in 1863. So we really have over a century of research targeting carbohydrates as a component of a cause of obesity, especially in Western civilization. And yet, now we see in that same journal, JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, 1973, they're talking about the Atkins diet. And now, in contrast to the Atkins diet, essentially the low-carb diet being seen as healthy, now it's being seen as hazardous. That low-carb diet can produce hyperlipidemia, hypercholesterolemia, hypertriglyceridemia, increasing risk for coronary heart disease and atherosclerosis. So this really is a change in the approach to how diet affects a potential heart disease. Well, does it actually increase risk for heart disease? And what is it people would consume when they're on a very low carbohydrate or ketogenic diet? So here is just an example of a contemporary study which illustrates the kind of food that people would consume, especially in Western society, when they're on a very low or ketogenic diet. Called ketogenic because when you consume almost no carbohydrates, your liver therefore is going to convert fat into ketones. And ketones there are a very efficient form of energy to be processed by almost all organs, in particular by the brain and the heart. So on a ketogenic diet, basically on the left, one can consume almost any animal product without limitation of fat. Most vegetables are on a ketogenic diet, and some fruit as well. And in this particular study, people were told to consume at least 5 tablespoons of olive oil and some flaxseed oil. So what is restricted from consumption on the ketogenic diet? Essentially anything that will raise blood sugar. So no flour, no spaghetti, no bread, rice, sugar, no sweets, no sugar-sweetened fruit juices, and no soft drinks. And what they found is a dramatic loss of weight. These are people who were overweight and had either high cholesterol, they happen to weigh more, or people with normal cholesterol. And you see over the course of a year that, in fact, people lost a significant amount of weight. But this had been shown repeatedly now for well over 150 years. What really matters is when you look at risk factors for coronary heart disease. And here are 2 of the measures shown in this study that are so important related to heart disease. On the left, you see HDL. This is high-density lipoproteins. And so this very well correlates with heart disease. So increased HDL is associated with less heart disease. That's why it's called the good cholesterol, which increases naturally when people have a low-carb diet. On the far right, triglycerides are fats in the blood, and that's how fat is stored. And so you see extremely high triglycerides in people with type 2 diabetes. And you see this dramatic reduction in triglycerides over the course of the year for people on this low-carb diet. And the central graph is so incredibly important because you see high blood glucose is associated with all diseases of Western civilization. You see the group that has high cholesterol also has high fasting glucose, which clearly indicates these people are at high risk for heart disease. They've got type 2 diabetes. And it's completely alleviated as a result of a year of the low-carb diet. And so this clearly indicates that when someone eliminates carbohydrates from the diet, that they are healthy. There is no indication of increased risk of coronary heart disease. And just to confirm, again, from contemporary work, here you have a summary from some of the world's top scientists writing about carbohydrate restriction, which they are emphasizing prior to any other approach, that carbohydrate restriction should be the first approach in diabetes treatment. And the summary here is that carbohydrate restriction, the benefits are immediate, they are well documented, and there is no justification for concern with carbohydrate restriction. So the findings are very clear as to the benefits of carbohydrate restriction without a restriction of fat consumption. So why then, when we look at the recommendations and the kind of food people consume when they want to lose weight, fat has been demonized? When you look at the American Heart Association and their recommendations, they're not recommending a low carbohydrate diet. They're recommending lean meat, low fat, skim milk. So they're emphasizing reduced fat. And look at this, fat-free cheese, fat-free yogurt, fat-free ice cream, fat-free tuna salad. And in the middle there, you see chocolate cookies that are fat-free as if it's a health food. So what we're looking at now is completely contrary to all the research that indicates that what we need to be concerned about is excess sugar, not excess fat. Well, where did that come from? Where did this misinformation come from? Much of it can be based on the teachings, the writings, the beliefs of a man named Ancel Keys. And so Ancel Keys was a man who was in the 1950s and into the 1960s was seen as an expert on diet and health. Here he is on the cover of Time magazine in 1961. This is a man who truly had no real expertise in heart disease or diet. This is a man who believed that heart disease was caused by an excess consumption of fat, particularly saturated fat. And here you see what he said in this article. Americans eat too much fat, mostly saturated fat. It increases cholesterol, damages arteries, leads to coronary artery disease. So what you've got to do is get your cholesterol down by reducing fat in the diet to a total of 15% and cut saturated fat, that is fat from animal fat and tropical oils, to no more than 4% of total calories. It is so important to emphasize that he stated this as fact, and yet there was no support for this view that saturated fat caused coronary heart disease. This was his belief, which he stated as fact. Now, that was bad enough in 1961, but Ancel Keys was a powerful force on the American Heart Association, which then led to great promotion of this idea that liquid oils were healthy, solid oils were unhealthy. And here we see the current situation. Current website of the American Heart Association is to continue to demonize saturated fat, where they state you need to avoid butter. And they're emphasizing that palm and coconut oil are unhealthy because they'll raise your cholesterol and increase your risk for developing heart disease. And again, there is no good evidence to support these statements from the American Heart Association. So why do they present evidence that's clearly contrary to the science? We must look at the sponsors for the American Heart Association to understand this. And this slide also includes sponsors from the American Diabetes Association. But we focus now on the American Heart Association. They receive almost $1 billion per year from their sponsors, and a good percentage of that comes from the food industry, the cereal industry, the soybean oil industry, corn oil industry, the margarine industry. And so you understand that it is because we're looking at now 60 years of industry support that the American Heart Association now is willing to ignore the good science and promote the products of those companies that sponsor it. Well, it's not just the American Heart Association that was the problem. Let's look at another problem we have in trying to understand foods that are healthy and foods that are unhealthy. So this is work out of Harvard University, a review published in 1967, New England Journal of Medicine, on sugar and saturated fat. And so they show here very clearly that there is an association between sugar consumption and saturated fat consumption across different countries. And so within a country, sugar is associated with saturated fat. So you hear it circled in the USA. People consume a high amount of sugar and saturated fat, and Americans had a high incidence of heart disease. So it is important to understand that those two are correlated, and there is a correlation of sugar and fat consumption in relation to heart disease. Well, it's rather obvious. I've illustrated that in this slide here, that a meal in which you have both sugar and saturated fat is one in which you've got French fries and sugar sweetened soda and a cheeseburger, as well as ice cream for dessert. And so with all these different components, and if one consumes that often, yes, you're risking your likelihood for developing obesity and heart disease. But it's absurd to point just to the burger and say it is the meat, the saturated fat of the meat, that causes the obesity and heart disease. And so it is this paper that showed both the sugar and saturated fat contribute to heart disease. But let's now look at the conclusions of this study. What we see here in the conclusions is they're focusing on serum cholesterol, and that it's fat and cholesterol in the diet that's increasing your cholesterol. And they're emphasizing then lowering your consumption of saturated fat, and you've got to reduce your cholesterol. But the clear message in the study was that it's fat and sugar. So as the slide says, what happened to that message about consumption of fat with sugar? Well, let's look at the end of that conclusion. It is the responsibility and opportunity for the food industry to help us to have better health. And so what we need, according to these authors, is to have food that will lower fat. And so by lowering fat in the food, we lower our cholesterol, we improve our health. Why would they come to these conclusions when it's contrary to what they actually have in their paper? Well, this actually came out in 2016. What was not revealed in 1967 was that the sugar industry paid these scientists to minimize the link between sugar and heart disease and promote the idea that saturated fat consumption would actually cause heart disease. And so as one of the authors states right here, they could derail discussion about sugar for decades. So it is the sugar industry paying scientists under the table to promote the idea that fat causes heart disease and minimize any emphasis on sugar and heart disease. Well, we have one more important factor that contributed to this misinformation. In 1977, U.S. Senator George McGovern got together a committee to give guidelines to Americans for diet. And McGovern had been on a very low-fat diet, and he believed that that was healthy and all Americans should go on a low-fat diet. So this was a part of their dietary guidelines. And it was out of McGovern's committee that later developed the food pyramid, which you see here on the right. So the food pyramid minimizes both sugar and fat at the top. And at the bottom of the pyramid, they're telling people what they should eat per day. And the arrow points to the recommendation that people consume 6 to 11 servings of bread, cereal, rice, and pasta each day. This is completely contrary to what clinicians knew in the 19th century, that kind of diet would make people fat, would increase their risk of developing obesity and heart disease. Where did this come from? The food pyramid came from the U.S. Department of Agriculture to promote the sale of grains from the U.S. This had nothing to do with good health research. So that is where we got this message from misinformation from Ancel Keys, government guidelines, the American Heart Association, the food pyramid developed this message that what you need to fear is fat and cholesterol and that it was okay to eat carbs. And that is why we see now it is so common, this promotion of low-fat food, which should be healthy, which is completely incorrect. But what happened as a result of this recommendation that people eat less fat and that carbohydrates are okay? Here you see consumption in the U.S. over the decades from 1970 to 2000. The guidelines being made in the late 1970s. And you see as a result of both increased recommendation that people consume carbohydrates, people are having low-fat food, and that low-fat food tastes good, you've got to increase the sugar. You also have the development of high fructose corn syrup, which now is so incredibly cheap, you could go back for free refills at the fast food outlets, which are now proliferating with extremely cheap, low-carb food. And all that together now results in people are consuming more carbohydrates and relatively stable amount of fats and proteins. So along with that, now you see the obesity epidemic. The red line shows the rate of obesity in the U.S. from 1970, which is about 14%, which then into the 2000s, you see is now over a third of Americans are obese. And the green line shows as well the rate of obesity in children in the U.S. So it's clearly tied, this idea of low-fat foods are healthy, carbohydrates are not to be feared, and ultimately you have people getting fat. Ancel Keys also was the one that advocated for the Mediterranean diet, which is considered a low-fat diet, olive oil, grains, fish, fruits and vegetables, based on his view that the Italians were the healthiest people. Well, if you actually look at the data, something Ancel Keys was really not so amenable to, but if you look at contemporary data, each of the data points here is from a different European nation and region. And so what you're actually looking at is percent of calories on average consumed by the people in that region, that country, in relation to the rate of death from heart disease. And rather than a positive effect, as Ancel Keys stated, in fact, there's a negative correlation. The more saturated fat people consume as a percent of their total calories, the lower is the rate of death from heart disease. And in fact, if you go to the single point that is the most extreme, what you have are data from France. Overall, about 40% of the calories that people in France consume is from fat, and they consume the highest percentage of calories from saturated fat. And I like the saying from T.H. Huxley of the 19th century, the great tragedy of science is the slaying of a beautiful hypothesis by an ugly fact. So the hypothesis is that saturated fat consumption will cause obesity and heart disease. And that is destroyed by the entire country of France, 66 million people who consume a very high percentage of their diet from saturated fat and yet have an incredibly low rate of heart disease. And what do nutritionists do with this finding? They sweep it away and call it the French paradox. The French, who consume probably more liver than anyone in the world, they consume butter. They prefer butter to olive oil. And as this woman here represents what the French people look like, they have an incredibly low rate of both obesity and heart disease. This is the French paradox. How can it be Ansel Keys is right, and yet the French say he's wrong? Well, we just call it a paradox. But it's not a paradox. There's nothing unhealthy about consuming saturated fat, along with a moderate to low amount of carbohydrates. And in fact, if you look at obesity, and I like how this is displayed, you look at rate of obesity in different countries. You see Americans in the upper left. About a third of Americans are obese. A country where people probably eat the most low-fat food in the world are the fattest people in the world. And they're the French, consuming almost half of their calories from fat, and less than 10% of the French are obese. And I can tell you, I have been to France quite a few times, and when I see an obese person in France, more often than not, it's an American on vacation. It is not a local French person. So let's look at different forms. We focused on saturated fat primarily from animal sources. We could travel the world and look at different cultures, but what I'd like to do now is look at Polynesia, where the primary fat that people consume, primary cooking oil, is from coconut. And so the American Heart Association recommends that people not consume tropical oils, because you consume tropical oil, whether it's coconut or palm oil, raise your cholesterol, increase your risk for heart disease. Well, probably a better source, far better source of information, was a man that I greatly admire. Weston Price was a dentist who traveled the world almost a century ago. And he looked at primitive cultures and studied their health, primarily looking at their dental health. And he photographed people around the world. And he was able to study people who had their primitive diets based on the local food, as well as the people in the same area who then lived on Western type diets. And so here in one example, he's looking at people in the South Seas. He traveled extensively through the South Seas. And here are pictures from his observations of people who either consumed the local food, traditional diet, or consume more Western type foods. So here you see pictures of two people who are consumers of the native food. So it would be coconut and the local seafood and local plants. And he documented their extraordinary health, especially their dental health. You can see the quality of their teeth and their gums. And here you have on the right, people who had grown up instead with more Western foods. So white flour and sugar and polished rice. And so you see how now you have the deterioration of their dental health, deterioration of their teeth. It is just so clear that when you bring in the sugar and the bread, white flour, and as well the vegetable oil, which came in with Western food, you see the deterioration of health. And if you look at ecological studies, here is some more work out of Polynesia, which actually look, well, what's the rate of coronary heart disease in people that live primarily on tropical oil? In this case, we're looking at coconut oil. And it's stated right here from the study that vascular disease, that is heart disease, is uncommon in these populations in which they're consuming a high saturated fat diet from tropical oils. So if we're actually looking at people who live on the tropical oils, you're finding a relatively low rate of heart disease, completely contrary to the idea that saturated fat is unhealthy. And more contemporary study, and you're looking here at people who have heart disease. Okay? And you look at the people in Indonesia, a subset have heart disease, another subset do not have heart disease. And when you specifically compare how much coconut the two groups are consuming, you see no statistical relation. And so it's very clear in looking at the diet between these two groups that there is no evidence of a link between saturated fat intake and coronary heart disease. Now, more broadly, the good science is coming out. There are numerous meta-analyses now that are able to distinguish the saturated fat from the sugar consumption. And so when you look closely at what are people actually consuming in relation to heart disease, that here are the conclusions from these authors: that intake of saturated fat, and specifically here we're looking at animal fat, was not associated with coronary events or mortality, no relation of total fat to coronary events or mortality, and there is no improvement in coronary outcome in people on a low-fat diet. And this has now been replicated in the past decade by other meta-analyses that are clearly showing no association of saturated fat with coronary heart disease. This is also, I think, an important paper because here, what this author, Zoe Harcombe, in her dissertation work, looked at the research that had been conducted prior to 1983. So what was available to Ansel Keys? What was available to others as far as a possible connection of saturated fat to coronary heart disease? And the answer is there was nothing. And that's why they're saying that dietary advice to minimize saturated fat consumption was just not there. And the conclusion is it should not have been introduced. So when you look at over 150 years of research between diet and health, diet and specifically heart disease, you don't see a link specifically of saturated fat with coronary heart disease. Now let's go beyond just looking at diet and heart disease. What about how the treatment of food can affect your health? And that is that we're typically cooking food. We're cooking oil at high temperature. And when oil is cooked at a high temperature, it becomes rancid. It can turn toxic. You produce these toxic aldehydes. And so an oil can break down when it is cooked at high temperature. So in this study, the authors were looking at a comparison of coconut oil, butter, with these oils that are liquid at room temperature, olive oil, corn, and sunflower oil. And what you're finding is that these oils break down. The liquid oils at room temperature break down when cooked at high temperature. But the butter is less amenable to breaking down, but the most stable oil for cooking is the coconut. And so that is really important, and it's simple biochemistry. The coconut, being saturated, is much more resistant to break down at high temperature. So tropical oils in general, being high in saturated fat, completely contrary to them being unhealthy, are perhaps the best oil to use for cooking food because they're so resistant to breaking down at high temperature. And the same kind of study was conducted using palm oil compared to soybean oil and sunflower oil in this study, contemporary study, looking at the result of basically deep fat frying of French fries in these different kinds of oils. And so what these investigators did was that they cooked the oil for a period of time and then measured the oxidation, that is essentially becoming rancid, as a result of time being cooked. And so what you see how rapidly the soybean oil and the sunflower oil become toxic, become oxidized, and that's this graph on the left. So in about 3 hours or even less, the soybean oil, the sunflower oil are becoming oxidized. The PO, being the palm oil, is extremely resistant, that it took more than 12 hours of continuous heating before palm oil became oxidized. And that is why they're saying it's a statement of fact that palm oil is more stable. And so rather than hydrogenated fats, which are solid at room temperature, but a better oil to have that would be solid at room temperature would be palm oil. It's a far superior option for frying food. Now, palm oil is not only stable when you have cooking at high temperature, but palm oil is unique, which has been shown in many different papers. Here is just one showing biochemistry of palm oil and the nutritional values published this year. And so palm oil has many different components, in particular antioxidants, that have nutritional benefits. And so these authors are actually indicating so many of the antioxidants that are considered very healthy that are found that are unique to palm oil. Carotenoids, okay, alpha carotene, beta carotene, these are all antioxidants that are recognized as healthy. Now, vitamin E comes in multiple different forms, and palm oil is unique in that you have all the different forms of vitamin E in consuming palm oil. And so not only is palm oil stable in response to cooking, it intrinsically has more nutritional value. And the authors here summarize that in the palm oil that they were studying, that it's rich in the carotenoids and vitamin E and the polyphenols. And so this is what gives the palm oil its health benefits, and specifically how it has these antioxidant components. So we come to the conclusion in which I've covered just a bit of the research. But what we have to ultimately get to is an issue about cholesterol. People are so concerned about cholesterol. You consume palm oil, you raise your cholesterol. Well, first, the studies are just not there showing consumption of either coconut or palm oil will raise your cholesterol. This was a hypothetical. It turned out not to be correct. And here is a review just out last year, a meta-analysis of the entire literature that shows that if you're concerned about cholesterol, that's TC is total cholesterol, LDL-C is considered the bad cholesterol, TG stands for triglycerides. But first of all, there's no evidence that consumption of palm oil will raise your cholesterol. And if anything, there can be an increase in HDL, which is called the good cholesterol. So that's the first thing. If you have any concerns about cholesterol, they can be alleviated because there's no evidence that palm oil actually increases your cholesterol. But I'd like to take this to the next level. This is an area of my research. Here is one of the papers that I've published on this, saying this is another myth that is perpetuated by the American Heart Association, which is simply not correct. That even the bad cholesterol, the LDL, there is no good research linking LDL cholesterol to causing heart disease. And as I have in this quote, we have been deceived by decades of deception from, for example, the American Heart Association, when in fact LDL does not cause heart disease. This is an area of research that I have focused on for the past decade. I'm now publishing papers with cardiologists to try to right a wrong. So first, consumption of tropical oils does not increase cholesterol. And second, even if it did, it would not be something a person should be concerned about. And so I think it's very important to recognize that these views have been around for decades. What I'm presenting to you today is not really new, that people have been emphasizing the health benefits of tropical oils, in particular palm oil. People have also been implicating the American Heart Association in essentially a war on saturated fat, because that war is emphasized. It is fought as a financial war and not a health war. And so what you have seen written here almost 30 years ago is that these authors are saying that tropical oils, and particularly palm oil, has been cast as a villain by the USA, really by the American Heart Association. And that the unsuspecting public doesn't realize it, that this really has to do with a financial ploy. Because to emphasize consumption of liquid vegetable oil is to promote soybean oil, and corn oil, both of which are American products, and these are industries that support the American Heart Association. So what I have tried to emphasize here is the great benefit, the health benefits of tropical oils, both as far as great for cooking oils. They are highly stable under high heat conditions, and they have intrinsic health benefits. In particular, palm oil has intrinsic health benefits. So in summary, I call this dietary sense and nonsense. So what we have is sense that's gone back now over 150 years, in which you have excess carbohydrate clearly as the villain. That is what causes obesity. Going back to Claude Bernard's work in 1862, showing how the liver can produce all the sugar we need, and how what we do with that excess sugar is converted into fat. Consumption of fat does not make people fat. It is consumption of excess carbohydrates that causes people to become fat and increases their risk for coronary heart disease, as well as all the other diseases of Western civilization. The second component I talked about is, how did things go awry? Well, much of it, I would say, is placed right on the lap of Ansel Keys, but ultimately the sugar industry, which paid scientists to promote the idea that saturated fat is unhealthy, and the American government, which came out with dietary guidelines which emphasized low-fat food is healthy, and so low-fat food, you've got to add sugar to it or else it doesn't taste good. And so this is all a part of how science went awry. And you've got financial interests in the U.S. which support organizations such as the American Heart Association, which promotes misinformation to promote the sales of the products of the companies that sponsor them. And finally, I have emphasized that there's great value in using tropical oils, both for high temperature cooking and for the intrinsic health value, and that there is no cardiovascular disease risk. So I have shown how here in the liquid oils to the left, how rapidly they become rancid as a result of high temperature cooking, and how resistant the palm oil is to become oxidized or rancid. And it's oxidation that is unhealthy. And so clearly there is no evidence of cardiovascular disease risk with consumption and cooking of tropical oils, in particular the palm oil. So I thank you again for your attention. I thank you for inviting me to give this presentation. I am on Twitter. My username is LDL Skeptic, and I welcome any comments and questions that come from the audience.